All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. My clock says 10:15. My name is Jason Kelley. I'm with the University of Arkansas. I'm wheat and feed grains, and today we're going to talk about management practices to increase our yields in corn. I'm going to be the first half of the program, and Virgil King is going to give us a consultant's perspective on corn production. So I think we got about 50 minutes, and hopefully I don't take all Virgil's time, and hopefully we'll still have some time for some questions. So, we talk about corn, and if you look at last few years, our corn yields have definitely been going up. Mid-Arkansas, this is the Arkansas state average yields, and if you look there, since about 1980, it's been going up pretty rapidly. If you look across Louisiana, Mississippi, the Mid-South, I think those numbers, Wayne, probably going to match up pretty close, aren't they? We've got ups and downs depending on the weather, but that trend is definitely going up. And on average, we're getting close to that 2.5, 3 bushel increase per year. A lot of it's management, hybrids, weather, it's all a combination. We're doing a lot of things right. So, and there's a lot of things that impact that yield. And I think every year, we can blame the weather or praise the weather. That's one thing that really impacts yields. But there's lots of other things. Some things we can change and have an impact on. Some of them we can't, right? And, I put out several factors here that probably impact corn yield. And there's a whole lot more else, but hybrid, planting date, uniformity, plant population, there's a whole lot of different things. And I think if we polled the room here, I think everybody would agree that every one of those can impact yield, positively or negatively if we're late. And so, a couple years ago, we set up a group of trials, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, is what really increases our yields. What can we do to increase those yields? If you look at that yield curve, we've been going up over time. You look at the yield challenge numbers, they're quite a bit higher than that. But what we really want to do for our producers in the Mid-South, compare what our normal recommendations would be, and we'll define those here in a little bit, compared to adding some extra. So extra inputs. And some of these inputs were at what I would think would be non-limiting, yield-limiting inputs at those type of levels. And this kind of goes against the grain, and Virgil's going to talk a little bit about cutting back, but I think in reality this kind of also shows that extra doesn't always mean better. And we've got some economic numbers on here as well. So what we wanted to look at was just some basic components that probably impacted yield, or I thought may have impacted yield. I couldn't put that whole list in one trial, so we broke it down. Some things that we could do on our farm fairly simply change. And so, these are the things that we looked at. Deep tillage, we talked about deep tillage, everybody kind of, I don't want to do that. In-furrow starter fertilizer, there's a few guys using this. Some say it works, some say it doesn't. Probably depends on the year, soil, that sort of thing. Looked at some elevated plant populations, seed insecticide rate. Here a lot of instances where, we've always used Poncho 250 or Cruiser, a lower rate. What impact does those higher rates have? The last few years, especially when corn prices were good, I think about every acre in Arkansas seemed like it got sprayed with a fungicide. And sometimes it was needed, sometimes it wasn't. So we're going to look at that impact of that. Added fertility over above what we normally recommend. See what impact that had. And then, kind of interesting, we looked at all these factors individually, and then we combined them together to see really what we did. And so, a little bit of background on the trials we had this past year. We've done this for 3 years. I hadn't got 2015s in here. We're just going to talk about 13 and 14. Had trials at Mariana, which is basically across the river in Arkansas, southwest of here, probably about 50 miles, and one a little bit further south in Rower. But eastern Arkansas Delta region, our planting dates for these trials over those 2 years, relatively late for our location. To me, I'd rather have the end of March, 1st of April in general, but cool, wet these years. And it worked out pretty well anyway. 38-inch rows. I'd like to have a twin row or something narrower, but in our situation, these sites, we're predominantly single 38s, so that's what we went with. Conventional tillage up on raised beds for furrow irrigation. Previous crop was soybean or corn. The soils were silt loam. At rower, kind of varied from year to year, but something a little bit heavier. We had some silt loam up on top. You didn't have to go very far down. You ran in some Sharky clay. The hybrids we primarily looked at, Pioneer 2088 or 89, and then 1739. So what I want to do is kind of go through each of these inputs, and I'll let you guys decide whether it's going to be economical for you or not. But one of the first things we looked at was deep tillage. How many of you guys do deep tillage on fall for corn? Quite a few of you do. Feel like it does well for you? Yeah, I think in a lot of instances it does. So this trial here, we did it ahead of planting. We'd already had our beds made. This is a ripper hipper. It doesn't really look like it, but that's what we're doing. We had large strips here. Kind of hard to see, but we were running that ripper there about 18 inches deep. It was a 4-row, and I think it was John Deere 8300, and that's basically all it wanted. And so we went pretty deep. We were pulling up some chunks. Thought, well, maybe we're doing some good there. Wayne, what do you think happened? Well, yeah, so this is Mariana and Rower. I've got several of these slides we're going to go through, but basically each number here is an average of 4 trials. So we've got our treatment here, deep tillage versus none, and this is our yield response. So when we deep tilled, on average, it was 2 bushel less. We ran the statistics, it didn't make a difference, but numerically it was slightly less. So in other words, we didn't do any benefit.
This was always spring?
This was always ahead, a month or so prior to planting. It wasn't fall tillage. I would have liked to have done it in the fall, but that's how it ended up. Do we bring up some stuff that we didn't need to? Maybe we did. I don't know. But we had rains to settle things back down. So on average, we lost 2 bushel, and roughly that operation cost us 12.
See if you had soil compaction before you did that.
I would say in general there wasn't all that much compaction, but you could take a bicycle flag out there, especially at Mariana, you go down 8 to 10 inches as far as you could go. Now when we ran that ripper, we were bringing up some pretty good sized chunks, so we thought we were doing some good, but full irrigation, maybe that masked any effects of that deep tillage. So in these 4 trials, we didn't see a response. Now, not to say other soils, different year, dry land, it might have made a difference. So another thing we looked at was starter fertilizer. How many of you guys use starter fertilizer in your corn programs? Quite a few of you. Pop up. Ours was in furrow. I mean, some of them used 2x2. We were set up. We put it directly in the seed furrow. A lot of guys are thinking about that and have went to that. Some aren't, but our products varied per location and year, but roughly about 3 gallons of an 8-19-3 plus zinc or a 6-20-0 plus some zinc. Those were the mixes we used. Roughly 3 gallons an acre. And if you look at how that turned out, for location average, we got 7 bushel. Now, Virgil say, there's some instances where we didn't get a response, and then others we had 10, 12 bushel response. So it varied by year, varied by location, soil type probably played a difference in that. So I think, on average 7 bushel, and you could argue about the cost there, but we're probably at least breaking even on that input there. Plant population. Well, you go to a lot of meetings and we talk about increasing plant populations. And Brian Henry, Mississippi State, he's got some programs later today talking about plant populations. And we looked at some of that as well. And when we went from 33,000 up to 40,000, on average, we got 6 bushel. And that's going to vary by hybrid. The Pioneer 2088, 89, or 1739 to me is probably not all that responsive. I've got some other hybrids that was probably more responsive. We even had one instance where our yield actually went down. So on average, we gained about 6 bushel, cost us about $24, break even, right? Probably some risks there. And if you look at what we've seen in the past on plant population, this is some work we've done a few years ago, but we get up there 32, 33,000. Our yields probably plateau, but like I say, that really depends on hybrid. There's some hybrids out there I had this past year. I needed 45,000 or more to maximize yields even on single 38s. So there's some differences out there, so take that in context when I'm talking about these numbers here. So on average, we didn't gain a lot right there. All right, seed insecticide rate. It seems like this is something we're hearing a little bit more about. You know, these trials were relatively late planted, conventional tilled, probably conditions where you really wouldn't expect a lot of difference. And if we look at what happened, you know, 4 bushel on average going from a Poncho 250 to a 1250 with the Votivo on it, 4 bushel, you know, probably break even. We didn't gain a lot. We didn't have a lot of insect pressure out there, wireworms or anything like that. No-till, maybe we would have saw more differences, but going at the higher rate, we just didn't see much this past year. Foliar fungicides. You know, we this past year, this coming year, 350 corn, we're really trying to figure out how to make it pencil out, right? And, you know, I'm talking about a lot of these extra inputs, and I'll get to the punchline here in just a little bit. But, you know, we've used a lot of foliar fungicides in the last couple of years. And our biggest concern is southern rust. Sometimes we have northern corn leaf blight. But, you know, the southern rust is the big thing. And this is a picture, I'm not sure how well it shows up here, but this is our trial at Mariana. I think 2 years ago. The plot there on the left, we put foliar fungicide, and that consisted of Headline at V5, followed by Quilt XL at R2. So we, like I say, we spent a lot of money. We wanted to see really whether we were doing anything, compared to nothing on the right. And there were some pretty good visual differences out there at the end of the season. We had green plants, or relatively green plants, versus plants that were pretty dead. Now, this came in late in the season. On average, 4 trials with the 2 fungicide applications versus none, 6 bushel. So now, you know, that relates back to IPM. If we don't have any disease or it comes late enough in the season, it's not going to make a difference. And that's really what we saw. Those fungicides with application, I don't know, $45, somewhere in that range. You know, we got 6 bushels. So we didn't gain anything there. So I'm not probably being real positive here, giving you a real rosy picture on economics right now. But so extra fertilizer. You know, in times of trying to cut back, you know, we may be falling back to maybe what our normal recommendations would be. And I think sometimes the perception is that university recommendations may be a little bit low. You know, if we were shooting for 250 or 300 bushel corn. Well, we wanted to look at that in this fertilizer component. So we basically looked at our normal recommendations. On all these sites, we followed the normal P&K recommendations based on soil test recommendations. Included sulfur and zinc. We've had sulfur and zinc problems at both of these sites. Our nitrogen rate was 220 units of nitrogen. The Mariana was a silt loam. At Rower, it's kind of a silt loam clay. We kind of went in between where we would normally recommend. That was 260 units. So these are recommendations for 220, 225 bushel corn. And this is the nitrogen provides side dress, or a pre-plant, and then side dress about 4 leaf. So our additional, this is what we added additionally. So we added a whole lot more nitrogen to it. 150 more units of nitrogen, 60 pounds of potash, 24 units of sulfur, and this nitrogen, in addition to what we did up here, we had some about 10 leaf and then 14 leaf. So we had it spaced out, trying to be as efficient as we could. So, you know, in corn, we always hear water and fertilizer, right? Well, we put a lot of extra fertilizer out there. 4 trial average, this much extra fertilizer in addition to what we normally put out, 8 bushel. So, you know, if you look at that, we didn't have flooding, real flooding range. You know, we were timely with everything. We were trying to be as efficient as we could. 8 extra bushel there cost us a lot of extra money there. So we looked at each of these individually, right? Anything really grab your attention? Probably not. It doesn't to me. So one thing, we looked at all those individually, but what happens when you put them all together? So in other words, we put all those inputs together compared to what we would normally do. Kind of interesting here when we combine all these inputs together, compared to our normal recommendations versus doing everything together here, we got an extra 21 bushel. What was interesting to me is there wasn't any one of these single inputs that added up to close to that. So that tells me they're all additive. You know, even though statistically some of these didn't make a difference, something was going on there that the sum total of all of them together was quite a bit larger than all these others. And so, you know, 21 extra bushel, we got our average here was up to 285 bushel. That's pretty dang good corn. We had one of them up there 300, some a little less, but on average we did that. What was interesting in, you know, today's day, trying to save money, you know, that extra 21 bushel cost us on average, according to my figures, yours may be different, over $250. And so I guess what I was a little bit surprised here are our recommendations, which I feel pretty comfortable with. You know, that gave us over 90% of our maximum yield. And if you run the economics on it, which my cowboy economics here, we're definitely making more money on the extension recommendations. So I think in summary here, like I say, that our extension recommendations, I think sometimes we feel like they may be a little bit short sometimes, but in our situation, these 4 trials, I think they were right on as far as in our input system. To me, more inputs don't necessarily mean more yield or profit. You know, I hear numbers a lot larger than these. You know, in these trials, there was something limiting yield. And to me, it was probably drainage, internal drainage. Both of these sites, within 100 yards, we're growing rice. And so, you know, a wet year, we're furrow irrigating. You know, I think sometimes that may be really what is limiting our yield. So, you know, to me, the big picture, all these small things, planting it timely, right hybrid, getting it all to come up properly, you know, all these small things, ability to irrigate, get the water off in some instances, that may be as important. So to me, timeliness of all the inputs right now is probably the big thing we need to be focused on for this coming year. So I know I went through a lot here really quickly, and I'd be open to questions, comments. We're going to continue some of this work this coming year, trying to figure out really what is limiting our yield besides, say, you know, the generic it's a drainage problem or something like that. So, and this is some projects that were funded by our checkoff program, Arkansas Corn and Grain Sorghum Promotion Board. So, with that, I'm going to stop there. Yeah, Wayne.
Jason, have you contemplated? Okay, you did individuals. Have you contemplated the concept of using 1 + 1, 2 + 1, 3 + 1? I've tried to get that funded in Mississippi and haven't succeeded yet, but I think that would help to see if there's, say, a combination of, say, if you increase seeding rate and increase nitrogen.
Yeah.
You know, with those 2 things together, maybe account for that 21, where other things don't. But I haven't succeeded yet either. So.
Well, this was a project, like I say, we wanted to do a shotgun approach. And so, you know, let's see basics, you know, what impacts yield, what doesn't. And now this coming year, we're going to do some more, pull this out, you know, do some more things like what you're talking about. I mean, there were some things in there that didn't make any economic sense, and so that's what we're going to try to do.
If you added up all of your things, you know, 4 + 6 + 8 +, you know, it's like 40 bushel.
Yeah.
And it only accounted for actually 21.
Yeah, and these, yeah, if you add all these up, it's never going to add up to exactly what you think it ought to. Yeah. Yeah, Randy?
Did you pull tissue tests during the year to see if there were other, I mean, you got a $136 charge there for fertilizer.
Yeah.
Were there any other yield limiting factors such as micronutrients, secondary major nutrients, et cetera, that could have been contributing to a yield loss? And did you address any of those in the pre-plant fertility or at least check it during the year?
The question was, did we take tissue samples and then basically anything show up there that might have been limiting? And we did. The only thing and we put zinc out prior at planting, and then our starter fertilizer had a little bit of zinc in it as well. But even then, our tissue samples at, say, V10, V12, we took them weekly or every 10 days, something like that. The zinc was still showing low, even though we put quite a bit of zinc out there. Now our nitrogen, we put all that nitrogen out there, And to me, the nitrogen levels weren't as high as I thought they should have been. You know, at V5, we were at that 5% nitrogen level, or close to it. Once we, you know, of course, later on it drops. Boron, you know, those levels seem low, and that's something else where, you know, this is a shotgun approach. We're going to try to narrow some things down. That's something we're looking at as well.
The biggest problem I have with tissue samples when you do measure, if everything comes back sufficient, you feel pretty good based on what that lab's telling you.
Yeah.
Is sufficient. The next question we have to ask ourselves, that's sufficient for what yield? Is that good for 100 bushel corn or 500 bushel?
Yeah. And one of the things that we did, even we set aside some plots to take tissue samples. And so, you know, we were coming back to the same area, the size of this room, and taking tissue samples every week or every 10 days. And even then, you know, sampling the right leaf, we had a lot of variability. You know, in other words, one week, man, it looks like we're on course. The next week, well, what's going on here? The next week after, it's back up to where we thought it was. So there was some variability, even though we were taking it from a relatively small spot. Yes, sir.
When you get into the tissue sample, it's gonna vary,
Yeah.
and it can vary from week to week.
Yeah. You're going to have variation depending on plant size. But, you know, we tried to minimize as much as we could by, you know, sampling one area so we weren't over here and over here to pick up bigger variability.
That this is real, because it's gonna change, it's gonna be fluctuating.
Yeah.
And if you're a consultant or something in the field, or you're a research person, then you've got to learn to make decisions on where you are at those levels, because there's no real guidelines.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's still a learning process for us, and we're still learning. Yes, sir.
Have you done any studies between the difference between the dry over the top versus 90 and 32%?
In all these trials, the question was whether or not we've looked at dry fertilizer or a liquid. I assume you're talking 32%. And all these trials, we had 32%. We knifed it in. You know, we didn't have to worry about losing any nitrogen. And so, you know, to me, I'd rather use 32%. But I know not everybody has access to it. Sometimes it gets wet, and you know we're going to have to put something out. We can't get on the ground. So, you know, my preference would be 32%. But if you get a rainfall on it, you know, right after you put out the dry urea, it ought to be sufficient.
Jason, just out of curiosity, on your additional fertilizer, you don't have any additional P in there.
The question was on our additional fertilizer, we didn't have any additional phosphorus, and both of these sites were above optimum. You know, I'm not going to say off the charts, but we're very high to begin with. Any other questions? Yeah.
You said it was for irrigation. How much water was applied during the growth cycle, and what for irrigation?
The question was how many irrigations did we do, and basically how did we determine when to do it. Each year, you know, I think this past year, 5 or 6 times, 5 to 10 times. And so there was never any time when the irrigation was limiting. We had some soil sensors out there this past year. They never dipped below or got close to what I would call a critical level. I think we were probably more on a non-technical way of watering when it got time. You know, if it had been 5, 6, 7 days and we knew it was going to be getting dry, we turned it on. But this corn never stressed for lack of water. Yes.
Deep tillage, do you think that saved you water?
In this instance, we fully irrigated. I don't know that it did. In a dry land or limited irrigation, it could have. Now, we went out there and dug roots down, even though we went down, you know, see how far the roots went down. Even though we went 18 inches deep, we were hard-pressed to find any roots below a foot. And I don't know if it's, you know, there's no reason to go down there. If it's wet, saturated, they're not going to go down. But, you know, I think in some instances there would be some benefit. Or you might be able to go a little bit longer, especially that first watering in there. Yeah, Brian?
Were your early growing season conditions real wet in the years where these were conducted?
The growing conditions are up front were wet. I think both these years were, April, May, June were relatively wet. Later on, it may have got dry for a little bit, but up front, it was wet during the growing season. Tell you what, I'm going to let Virgil come up, and then if we don't want to take up all his time, and if we got more questions at the end, we can address those. So I'm going to